Lent, a time of repentance, a time of sacrifice, a time of confession, a time of preparation, a time of suffering, a time of temptation, a time of examination, a time of what? Prayer? There's no theme that's more central to our celebration of Lent than prayer. So this year, I've been studying the prayers that Jesus prayed in the last 24 hours of his life, and I'm going to share my reflections with you in this season. Today, we're going to talk about the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then when I get back from vacation, we'll talk about 3 from the cross. Father, forgive them. Why have you forsaken me? And into thy hands I commend my spirit. Every single one of these prayers is just a gut-wrenching kind of deep prayer, and every single one of them reveals the interplay between Jesus' divinity and humanity, and every one of them provides us a model for our praying. So after the Last Supper, Jesus took 3 of his closest friends. These are the same 3 we talked about last week when we talked about the Transfiguration. He took 3 of his closest friends, Peter, James, and John, and they walked through the city. They were in Jerusalem. They walked through the city, out the east gate, down in the Kidron Valley, across the valley, and as they started to come up the hill, they came to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, Gethsemane means olive press. This was an olive orchard. And I've been there. Today, it contains about 8 trees that you see up here on the screen. It's beside the Church of All Nations on the Mount of Olives there. And these gnarled and twisted trees, one of the main images in my mind is just how gnarled and twisted these trees look. They look like ancient. They look like they could have been with Jesus that day when he prayed that prayer that was so important to him. Actually, a study back in 2012 says that the wood is actually about 1,000 years old. So the wood's not old enough. But the interesting thing about olive trees is they re-sprout. If you damage an olive tree, if you cut it down, it re-sprouts. So it's not the same wood that was there when Jesus was there, but it's the same organism. It's the same trees that were there when Jesus prayed in the garden, one of the most important prayers of his life. As you walk into the Church of All Nations, there's a rock that's in the middle of the sanctuary. And around that rock is a short fence. And you see the birds on there. Those are doves and sorry, I forgot what kind of bird they are. Pigeons. There we go. Doves and pigeons. And those are the sacrifices. That's the sacrifice that Mary and Joseph made right after Jesus was born. That was the prescribed sacrifice. And it also reminds us that Jesus was going to become our sacrifice. You also see cups on there. You can see a little cup over here. There's one there. And that's to remind us that Jesus prayed that if this cup can pass, please let it pass. Now in the middle there is a blonde piece of limestone, of bedrock, and it's about 6 feet by 8 feet, something like that as I recall. And this is the rock that tradition says Jesus prayed at this rock when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. I thought it would be taller, from that picture that we have of Jesus kneeling in the Garden of Gethsemane, that painting. But over the years, debris may have filled it in, who knows? And that was just an artist's rendition. But they say this is the rock at which Jesus prayed. And I remember kneeling down and touching that rock. They have it so you can actually touch it. Kneeling down and touching that rock, and it just felt just a heaviness. Just a heaviness, the kind of heaviness that you might feel if you're making a decision that either for good or for bad is going to affect your life forever and there's no going back. That's just the sense that I had as I was touching that rock. For Jesus, it literally was a life and death decision. So in our Matthew passage, Jesus tells the disciples, "My soul is deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And Jesus' humanity is on full display here. He needed his friends. He took his 3 closest friends, and he needed all the support he could get. He needed all the prayers he could get. He just needed them to stay awake while he fought this battle with himself and his own will and God's will. He just wanted them to stay awake with him. That's his humanity showing forth. Now, what Jesus was struggling with, we don't often talk about this, but Jesus was really struggling at this point. Could he have just run into the desert and disappeared forever? Yeah, he could have, frankly. Could he have gathered a crowd and given them swords to fight against the temple guard that would come arrest him? Well, he could have. Could he have said, this is just too hard, I'm not going to do it? Well, he could have. And I think those are the kinds of things that deeply grieved his soul, that those were things that came to his mind that he struggled with, and those are the prayers that he was praying that night. And it says he went a little farther after he left his friends, went a little farther, I think it's Luke that says just a stone's throw, so not all that far, and he fell on his face on the ground, and he prayed, Father, if it's possible, take this cup of suffering away from me. Now, we tend to sanitize this story. We tend to see a nice, clean, well-groomed Jesus kneeling at the rock with his hand folded praying. But I think it might not have been that way. I've seen people with broken hearts. I've seen people who are deeply grieved in their hearts, and it's not a pretty sight. I think this scene in the Garden of Gethsemane was gritty and messy and probably drenched with tears and snot. Jesus, my guess, is Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane and with tears in his eyes probably tripped over one of those roots from those gnarly olive trees and landed on his face. And he laid there on the ground pounding the dirt and screaming and crying with snot running out of his nose and tears running down his face and mud caking on his face. And he's crying, no, I don't want it to end this way. It's too hard. I'm scared. They're coming for me. What are they going to do to me? What are they going to do to my friends? What are they going to do to my family? Everything I worked so hard for. There has to be another way. There has to be another way. I don't want to die yet. Not now. Not yet. And when he spent all the energy he had, he laid exhausted in a heap on the ground. And when he poured out everything, finally, he says, okay, Abba, which means Papa or Daddy. Okay, Abba, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. And 3 times he prays that. He goes back to his friends and he comes back. 3 times he prays this. 3 times he prayed, please let this cup pass from me. Find a different way. Don't make me do this. And that's a gut-wrenching, soul-tearing, agonizing, heartbreaking, painful prayer. But he didn't give up. There are 2 lessons in this part of the prayer. One is effective prayer is honest, deeply honest. You can't pull the wool over God's eyes. God knows what you feel. God knows what you're thinking. God knows what you want. And prayer, in part, is just being honest about that with God. Jesus could have put on a brave front. He could have said, I'm not afraid to be arrested and tortured and cruelly executed. But that would not have been the truth. He didn't. He was completely honest with God and himself, saying, I don't want this. If there's any way that this doesn't have to happen, please, God, please, Abba, don't let it happen. It was a complete, embarrassing, soul-bearing honesty that Jesus showed in this prayer. It was real prayer, completely pouring out everything to God, complete honesty. The second lesson in this prayer is persistence. Jesus didn't just pray once. And then one of the things I read this week, the prayer, then you pull the arm on the slot machine and you wait for the answer to prayer to come and hopefully it's the answer you want. Well, that's not the way Jesus prayed. Jesus prayed over and over again, probably more than 3 times. I think these 3 times in Matthew here probably are not the only times Jesus prayed this prayer. These are the 3 that are recorded in the Bible, though. But he prayed over and over and over. He prayed and he prayed and he prayed, please, no. In part, he's hoping to get through to God, but I think he's also trying to get through to himself. One of the things I've learned over the years is that prayer is less about changing God and more about changing me. And I think that's part of what Jesus was struggling with, to change his own feelings about this. He kept praying that same prayer, perhaps in part to get through to his agonized heart so that he'd be ready to submit to God. Real prayer is deeply honest and persistent. By deeply honest and very persistent, heart-changing prayer, Jesus was finally ready to pray, "Yet, not what I will, not what I want. My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." The key word here is yet, or in some translations, nevertheless. After persistently crying out to God in complete honesty, begging and pleading for God for an alternative plan, Jesus prays, "Nevertheless, yet your will be done." If we can't do it a different way, we'll do it your way. He submitted his own will to God. It's not easy. Luke tells us that Jesus prayed so hard that he sweat blood. Now, I've prayed hard, but I've never prayed hard enough to sweat blood. They call that hematihydrosis. And it's when you're under such stress and usually a little dehydration that the little capillaries, the blood vessels under your skin break, and the blood mixes with the sweat and it comes out as pink sweat. It looks like you're sweating blood. Now, whether that happened or whether Jesus was just sweating so hard that it looked like he'd cut himself and it was just dripping off of him, I don't know. But either way, he was praying hard. It was a deep, hard prayer. And after all that work, after all that hard work, he comes to that moment of submission and he says, nevertheless, Abba, not my will, but yours." Notice that submission comes only after honest, deeply honest, courageous prayer. It comes only after persistent prayer, and it comes after the nevertheless. Nevertheless. Too often, we jump over honest prayer to "thy will be done." We want to get right to the "thy will be done," and we think that's the right thing to do, but honestly, we're still stuck in our own will. We're not ready to submit to God's will. Sometimes we do that and we hope that God's will is going to mesh with ours. It just doesn't work that way sometimes. In order to completely submit to God, we have to start by being completely honest about our hearts, what we want, what we fear, what we need, and only then can we say, "Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." The story ends with verse 45 and 46, Jesus saying, "Look, the hour has come. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Don't look too deep in this part. The only thing I'm looking at here is that Jesus really meant what he said. When he said, "Nevertheless," he stuck with it. He didn't go back. He didn't waver. He didn't say, "Oh, let me pray one more time." Once he submitted to God, he submitted to God. After courageous, honest prayer, after persistent prayer, after the nevertheless, Jesus didn't look back. He said, "Thy will be done." And he meant it. He trusted completely in that Abba would help him do whatever he needed to do in order to accomplish God's will. There are times in our lives when we lie at the crossroads, when we have to resort to a Gethsemane-type prayer, not very often in our lives, I hope, but occasionally. But if we don't practice it, if we don't practice this kind of prayer, we're not going to be able to do it when the time comes. So today I want to encourage you to practice that kind of prayer. We're going to give you an opportunity to pray honestly and persistently, to bring yourself to that point of submitting to God and then letting go of your own will. Can you imagine that? Remember those four things. I want you to be completely honest in your prayer. Pour out your heart to God all the way down to your toenails. Be persistent. Yes, persistent with God, but also persistent with yourself. Give yourself an opportunity to actually change your heart, change your will. Pray again and again and again until you're really, really, really ready to say, "Thy will be done." And then let it happen. So I'm going to start you in a time of prayer here. I invite you to enter into the Gethsemane of your heart. We're going to start with a time of prayer, and then when I finish, Jake is going to start playing some music, and I'll move down to the middle here. And while you're praying persistently and honestly to offer your will to God so that you can submit to God, you can come up and receive the sign of the cross on your head or your hand as a sign of your journey toward the cross and past with Jesus. So get comfortable in the Gethsemane of your heart and bring some situation, some circumstance, something you're trying to control, something that you might fear, or maybe it's out of greed or shame or self-interest, something you're grieving maybe. Bring something to God, something you're struggling with. And you can look at these words up here on the screen to help you pray if they're helpful for you. They might guide that prayer. Pray anything you can, unedited, everything about your thoughts, everything about your feelings, everything about your desires. Pour it all into the situation without regard to how pretty it sounds or how realistic it may be. And I'm not cutting you short, but I want to make sure you know what to do next when you get to that point. When you feel you've poured everything out, everything you can, that's when you pray nevertheless. It's not my will, but your will. Nevertheless, into your hands I offer this situation. Or maybe one of the other, I think there's a slide up there that has some other ideas on it, the one before this slide. There we go. It has some other ideas of how you can pray that. And then ask yourself, does it feel right? When you pray, thy will be done, do you really mean it? If you don't mean it, go back to honest, persistent prayer. Start over again. Jesus had to do it 3 times. I probably have to do it 100 times before I get there. You may have to do it 5 or 6 times at least until you get to the point where it feels right to pray, thy will be done. Just as Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, let us offer our prayers to God.